Hi, my name is Anna Chinni. I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana. I went to North Central High School. I was born in Savannah, Georgia, and I was actually lucky enough to do a summer intensive there when I was in high school at SCAD. And that was sort of what I think started me down the, higher education art field. But I think I've always been interested in art since I was a kid. And then I was encouraged through high school by my teachers. And then finally, when I got to college, I was sort of thinking about what I wanted to go into, and I got interested in actually art therapy. And so I ended up doubling in studio art and psychology. I think my identity as an artist is still very much in flux. I think where my current work is probably started my senior year of college, sort of when I was doing my thesis work. I started looking a lot at sort of large-scale watercolors and sort of how material informs interpretation and sort of the feel of a piece. So I got really interested in sort of driving my subject matter by the sort of essence of the material I was using. And previously I had done some work concerning sort of figure and sort of abstracted figures as it related to my identity as a queer person. And then I'd also done a little bit of work sort of with story. I'm very inspired by the works of Suzanne Jackson. I think she's a really interesting and incredible artist. She plays on a lot of, I think her experience in theater and the way she implements that in like costuming work into her pieces and her like use of like very wash, like a acrylic wash, is really fascinating. And I think it's like it references some of, I think, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore's work, sort of looking at how costuming in theater is representative of how we portray identity. And then in turn, I think sort of Suzanne Jackson takes it a step further with her use of sort of myth and symbol and archetype. I think I'm most comfortable and confident in watercolor because that was my emphasis. And actually I've sort of shifted through what I paint on over the years. So I sort of started out with watercolor paper, but I didn't feel it was really getting the effect I wanted. I think it sort of looked a little bit too traditional or a little bit too sharp. So I shifted over to actually gesso boards, which allowed the water to bead and like drip, and it took a while to dry. It didn't absorb, obviously, because it's not very porous. And so that created some really interesting effects that I think sort of informed my current style. One of the ways that I find I make myself comfortable with my body and sort of have like learned to accept it. Like obviously I'm like 4'11", I have a really high-pitched voice, which makes me very self-conscious, especially when I introduce myself as queer, because I don't always come off that way. But I think that one way that I've sort of accounted for that and made myself comfortable with that is through almost disassociating from my body and thinking of myself as two separate entities, and my body as more of just this sort of shell object that I own, whereas I think my identity is much more fluid and expansive and isn't contained in like a physical manifestation of self. And so I think through my painting and technique that it allows me to interpret identity and body beyond this sort of like the tightness of contour and shape. I mean, most of my experience has been in student shows. So I was really excited for the opportunity to sort of step out of my comfort zone and sort of experience, a different sort of art community and sort of step into one which I think a lot of people have some shared sort of interest in art. And then obviously, I think sort of pride in general is very meaningful, so I wanted to be able to contribute and share sort of how I navigate queerness through my art with people, and hopefully people can relate to it. I think the world has been made much smaller through the internet, and I think communities have formed sort of across borders, and I think especially with the queer community, there's a lot of dependence on sort of like this global sense of community. And so there's been a lot of like shared visual motifs, I think, that have become relevant. I think also because I rely on mythology and sort of symbolism that hopefully is familiar to those who have, read or at least sort of are familiar with myth, regardless of where it is, can sort of work through and interpret that, I think, sort of across the board. So I think despite me being like an Indianapolis-based artist, I don't think I limit myself or feel overly influenced by my environment. I think a lot of my art is much more introspective and concerned with my interpretation of identity, which I think is broader than any single environment or any single location. Essentially, it's one of like the earliest myths, and probably one of the only Greek myths regarding same-sex love between like women, or I think in the case of Iphis, more non-binary fluid person, and it's an instance where we have a trans person. And so I tried to capture that through depicting a dual figure, sort of, which could represent either Iphis's sort of dual identity and navigation of that dual identity, or even the sort of connection between Iphis and Ianthe and this sort of like joint identity that they sort of formed through their decision to love regardless of Iphis's situation and identity. And then I depicted Isis, of course, who allowed for that love to prevail. I also included peacocks, which are a symbol of marriage and fertility. It was very sort of straightforward in what was being represented. I tried to stick to the material in the myth, and then apply my own sort of style to it, keeping things very loose and ambiguous, sort of allowing the foreground and background to merge and mix. I think ambiguity is a really important part of my work because it allows space for people to interpret and to sort of expand and identify with the piece without being too direct or too specific about what's being depicted. I think the myth like informs the interpretation of the piece but doesn't necessarily define it. So